everybody. I'm going to get started with the next presentation. My name is Koleda, and I'm a developer programs engineer with Google on the AdWords API team. And today I'm going to be doing a presentation of the BulkMutateJobService. So this is one of those new services you may have heard about in the V2009 API, and it's going to go into some detail today about what it is and kind of an overview of how it works and how to use it, and what the different pieces of this puzzle are. So we're just going to start with what is the BulkMutateJobService. As I mentioned, it's a new service, and it allows for the scheduling and running of bulk mutate jobs. Much like all of our services, they're usually named with the entity that you're manipulating. These jobs, their main job is to contain large batches of operations. So they only hold operations, which are things that you would pass into a mutate method normally, and they're made to process a lot of them. That's what the service is for. And the term is a little confusing from the last time I gave this presentation, but it's meant to do this work asynchronously. Now, asynchronously, I don't mean at like a SOAP level, like it's going to ping you back when it's done, but rather that, much like the V13 reporting service, it allows for the work to be done not while the request is open. So you set up the work to be done, you ping for the status, and then you get the results. So it's unlike a regular mutate request, which you send the request and then get the results all in one transaction. Now it's spread out over time. So it's asynchronous in that sense. And really this service is just a different way to accomplish the same things you're already doing. It doesn't really introduce any new features or any new functionality. It's really just taking what you already do, those same operations, and processing them in a different way. So what is a bulk mutate job? So this is what you're setting and manipulating. And it's actually a pretty complex object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the lowest level, kind of build it up to the full job. So as I mentioned, at the bottom, at the deepest level of a bulk mutate job is an operation. It's the same operations that you use in other services, and it currently supports the services you see here, with the idea that in the future, every new service that has an operation, hopefully you'll be able to run that in the BulkMutateJobService as well. So then you take these operations that you have and you package them into an operation stream. An operation stream is meant to contain many operations, and they're processed in a batched manner. So what that means is that if one of the operations in an operation stream fails, the whole stream isn't committed. So none of the operations are committed in that stream. So the goal here is that if you want to have certain operations and you want to either succeed or fail together, put them into a stream. And besides just that batch logic, the other part of an operation stream is that it defines a scoping entity. So it's kind of like a hint to the back end about in what context do these operations apply. And that can either currently be a campaign or an account. So you can say all of these operations are relevant to this specific campaign, or they're relevant to this account. And there are some limitations about how many campaigns and accounts you can specify per job, but that's the purpose of the scoping entity, is to kind of inform the back end about where these operations will apply. Feel free to ask questions along the way, but I do actually cover a lot in these slides, so you may want to hold this up to the end as well. So the next level up from operation streams is the bulk mutate request. A bulk mutate request is meant to contain many streams. And we also call this a part, so later on I'll be referring to this bulk mutate request as a part. And that's because its main purpose really is to allow your streams to be sent to the server in multiple requests. So rather than have to send all of your streams in one request, like here's my streams, you can send that in multiple requests. And so you're kind of splitting up your entire collection of streams into different parts. And each of these bulk mutate requests has an index on it, which just indicates in what position of the job does this part live. So you have so many streams and you need to make 3 different requests. You create one bulk mutate request with part 0, 1, 2, and that's how you get all of your operation streams uploaded to the server. And then the outermost level is where we have our actual bulk mutate job. So this is the entity that you're actually manipulating here. You're getting and setting, adding, and it's kind of the main unit of the BulkMutateJobService. On this bulk mutate job, you do have to define the total number of parts to expect in the job. And when you're actually getting it later on, it's going to be the object that has the status and the stats and the history and all the kind of meta information about this job that we want to learn. Everything else is kind of just wrappers to organize the data, but this is the entity that will have all that extra metadata associated with it. And much like other entities, when you create it, you get a unique ID, which you then use to refer to it later on, just like campaigns and ad groups. So that's a little bit about the hierarchy, but then how do you actually use the BulkMutateJobService, right? So now that we know the structure of a job, what is the general process to use the service? So the overview here, it's at a very generic level, but I think it gives you a good idea of the flow. And so the first thing you need to do is just get your operations. What this means is, whether you're generating your operations through some sort of automated utility or by taking user input, you need to take all of the operations that you would normally run at once, like as soon as you created them, and collect them somehow into a larger pool so they can be bulk processed. And so this is really just reusing your existing logic and rather than executing them right away, saving them for later. I'm going to intersperse some sample code here. So this is just some generic sample code about, let's say you were creating a new text ad. This is how you would create your operation by creating the ad group ad and then finally the operation. So this is a little bit different than V13. Obviously, you didn't have this concept of operations or an ad group ad, but this is the same thing you're going to be doing. Regardless of the operation, you're going to be creating your operations first. So this is an example of a possible operation. So the next part of the process is to create your streams. So you've got those operations, and now you need to bundle them into some sort of streams. Like I said earlier, one of the determining criteria of which operations go in which stream is their scoping entity. So all of the operations in, let's say, a certain campaign against a certain campaign should go in one operation stream or a series of operation streams. But you can't violate that scoping entity contract. So you cannot have an operation stream that targets one campaign, but has operations within it that actually operate against multiple campaigns. So although it's kind of like a hint to the back end, you are required to obey that as well. And the other thing you may want to, like I mentioned earlier, decide about when you're creating your streams is which operations do I want to batch together and run in that kind of way where if one fails, the whole thing fails. Here's an example of creating an operation stream. You see it's a very lightweight object. It just has the scoping entity, which is an ID, like a campaign ID, and then the actual operations. Okay, so the next part of the process here is creating the different parts. If you have an operation, bulk mutate job that's not very large, you can just send everything in one part. There's no reason and no requirement to have multiple parts. But if you can only send so much data over your outbound connections, or you can only keep your connections open for so long, it may not be possible to send all of your information in one big request. So it's a little bit of balance and figuring out what your specific server environment can do as far as how big can you make one request. So it's a little bit of back and forth there and figuring out what will work. But at the minimum, you need to just have one bulk mutate request, and then just put your existing operation streams in those requests and set the index. So the index is zero-based, and it does affect how they're processed. So parts that are higher in index that come first will be processed first. So all the operations in a stream are processed in order, and all the parts are processed in order. So the order does play some effect if you do have operations that maybe depend on each other. So here's an example of creating a bulk mutate request part. Once again, very simple object, just holds a number of operation streams and the counter, the index of the player. All right, so next up is actually creating the job object. So what you want to do here is you want to build up your bulk mutate job, which once again is not very complex. Set the total number of parts that you plan to put into this job, and then call the BulkMutateJobService mutate method with the add operation. So the first time that you're uploading a part, you want to use the add operation, much as you would add a campaign or add an ad group. And then when you run this, you'll obviously get back a result that includes an ID that you can then use to refer to that bulk mutate job later on. This is an example of creating the bulk mutate job. As I mentioned, just the number of parts, and then setting the first part in the job. And then creating the add operation, and finally calling the mutate method. So then you have to upload your remaining parts. So you've added the job, but let's say you still have more parts that need to be sent to the server. So for the remaining parts, you're going to use the set method. So you use that, the set operation. So you use the add operation when you're creating that job, but then for the rest of the parts, you use the set operation, passing in the other parts. So the job has one slot for the bulk mutate request, one slot for the part. And so on the creation of the job, you send in the first part with add, and then to upload the remaining parts, you just kind of swap out the bulk mutate request with the next one, and then call set and set again until all of your parts have been set on the job or uploaded to the server. This is an example here of how you would kind of upload your remaining parts. So you'd have some sort of loop that for each part would set that part on the job, create an operation to a set operation on that job now that it has the new part inside of it, and then call the mutate method again. All right, so the next part here is very familiar for people working with a report service, which is you have to wait for it to complete. So how this is done is by using the BulkMutateJobService with the get method, passing in to the selector the ID of the job that you're monitoring. You can also do a selector for all jobs and find out all of the job statuses. And so in the waiting for completion, you're going to run the get method, and then there's different statuses that can come back. As I mentioned, one of them is called pending. Pending means two things. Pending means either that your job has not been fully uploaded yet, so you've set 3 parts and uploaded 2. Your job will be pending, as in it's not complete yet. It'll also be pending if it hasn't yet begun to run, if it has all the parts but hasn't started yet. I'll mention it later on, but basically every account has a queue, much like a report queue. You have a bulk mutate job queue, and only one of your jobs will run at a time. So if you've created many jobs, and some other jobs ahead of it haven't finished yet, it's going to remain pending until it starts. So pending kind of is a dual meaning in that situation. Processing means that the job is at the front of the queue and is actually running the operations at that time. And then when it's done, it's either going to be completed or failed. Those are the two kind of final statuses. Completed doesn't mean that everything in it was successful. Completed means that the job was able to complete, but there wasn't some horrific error that made it to the job vendor report. There could still be failures in individual operations, but as a whole, the job completed. So failed is a much more serious kind of error, that something big happened that made it to the whole job could not complete. So here's an example of how you would kind of ping for the job status. You use the bulk mutate job selector, passing in the ID of your job, and then just do a loop calling the get method on that selector, and just determine whether or not it's still pending in processing or if it's finished. As for bulk mutate jobs, they're meant to be large jobs, so it is going to take a while for these jobs to run. So we do recommend don't ping it every few milliseconds because it's going to take a while. So just kind of space out those calls so that you don't waste units or put extra load on the servers. So the next step here is getting the results. So unlike a regular mutate request where you get the results immediately, now you kind of have to retrieve the results. Much as you uploaded the parts, you have to kind of download the results. And so basically what you do here is you use the same bulk mutate job service get method, but you set a result part index, which is kind of like correlates to your initial bulk mutate request part index. So as you uploaded a part, now you're going to be downloading a part by specifying the index. So using the get method with the result part index, instead of back in the pinging step here, when we were getting the job, if you don't set a result part index, all you really get is that outer job shell. You don't get any of the inner parts, like the results, the request parts, or the operation streams. You're kind of just getting that outer shell of a job with the kind of metadata around it. In order to get the actual results back, you need to set the result part index. And now you get kind of like a fully completed job with all of the pieces inside of it. So here's an example here where, for each of the number of request parts that we've uploaded, we're just going to set the part index, the result part index on the selector, and then run the get method. And then we can get the job with the results inside of it. And then we can kind of add those results or process those results immediately. But you need to basically download all of your results to see what happened. And I didn't say it explicitly here, but as you can see, this is the structure of what a result looks like, and it's a perfect mirror of the request, right? So before there was a bulk mutate request, there was not a bulk mutate result. There was an operation stream, there's an operation stream result, and then for each operation, there's an operation result. So it's kind of a mirroring of what you passed in. And so the last part here, now that you've got all your results, to examine them and figure out what happened. So an operation stream result, the correlated object to an operation stream, contains these operation result objects, and there are different types of operation results. So the one you'll probably see most often and hope for is a return value result. This means that the operation completed successfully and it returned something. So normally if you do an add operation, what is returned is the entity with an ID, as it now exists. So you kind of get back whatever you were adding. Or if you do an update, you get back the object that you updated. So for a return value result, it's got kind of a strange nesting to it that if anyone here has used it yet, it's a little, it can be a little difficult to work with, but essentially a return value result has an operand inside of it, and that operand then has the actual object inside of it. So the operand object, it actually has a field for every possible entity that could be returned in it. So it has like a campaign field, and it has an ad group field, and one of those will have a value in it, and that's what was returned by the operation. So I'll show you an example on the next page here to kind of clear it up. But the other types of results, there's also a failure result. That's in the case that you tried to apply an operation and it failed. That failure result will have information like the API errors that you would expect to see and the reasons. And then there's a batch failure result. A batch failure result means that that operation itself didn't fail, but because another operation in that stream failed, it was not actually executed. So the batch failure result means some other operation caused me not to process because it failed. So here's a very detailed example of how you can process these operation results. So in the first few lines, we're kind of just testing to see what kind of operation result we got back, whether it's a failure result or a batch failure. And in this example, we're obviously just printing out to the screen. And then at the bottom there, the final case is if it's a return value result. So as I mentioned, in Java, how that works out is that there's going to be a get something method. There's going to be like a get campaign or a get ad on this operand object. And so what we did in this case here is we're actually just using some reflection where we know what object we're expecting out of this operation, and so we're running the get that object method. It's, like I said, it's a little difficult to deal with this operand object, but there were just some technical limitations that kind of required it. So that's why you might have to create some creative solutions in order to pull out your objects from this operand. And so this is just another screen kind of showing, this is right from the documentation, so you can see this on the AdWords API documentation, but this is the operand object, and as you can see, it has these different fields that correlate to the different types of objects that could be returned by the operations. All right, so now that we've seen, what our bulk mutate job is and how you can use it, why would you use it? What are the benefits here? So the number one is that it's cheaper. All operations processed by the bulk mutate job service are 50% less. So depending upon what you're doing, that could be a big savings. The other thing that we mentioned earlier is that it's kind of asynchronous, right? So you don't need to keep your connections open while you're waiting for things to process. I think there have been some cases in the past where you send a large number of operations at once, your connection gets interrupted, cut off, either by on your side or our side, and then you don't really know what happened. And so you've had to scale back maybe how many operations you send at once. So rather than kind of scale that back and kind of configure it that way, you can not have to wait and keep your connection open while the server is doing the work. You only need to send the information, ping the status, and then get it all implemented. The other thing that I think is pretty nice about this is operation rate limiting. So we touched a little bit earlier today about kind of quota system and rate systems and QPS. And a lot of these things can be, like we said, we can't really reveal all the specifics, so they can be a little tough to deal with. But what's nice about the BulkMutateJobService is that it knows and it applies things as fast as it can. So if you give it a set of operations, you don't have to worry, well, am I sending too many operations too quickly? Is this going over the amount that I'm allowed to process? You just give it to the BulkMutateJobService, and it'll apply them at whatever rate is appropriate as fast as it can. So yeah, I mentioned the transient failures, and the other thing, which we found out last time from the developer, is that, and we brought it up earlier, is there any sort of concurrency possible? And it turned out there actually is some concurrency in place right now in how it operates. So what's happening is that operations under different scoping entities, so if you have some operations under one campaign scoping entity, another operations stream under another campaign scoping entity, those currently are processed in parallel. So you don't necessarily process every single operation one after another. If they target different scoping entities, they are currently processed in parallel. Now, something to be clear here is that the design and the goals of the BulkMutateJobService was not to get things done faster, right? I think a lot of people have that expectation, and while this last line can lead to things getting done faster, that's not really the end goal. The end goal is really to kind of take away a lot of the manual work you have to do in your program and doing that at the back end and applying all of these rules automatically. So it's, yeah, as we pointed out here, reduce chatter, reduce the number of requests, kind of just take away a lot of those tasks and have them done by the back end, but not that you can get the same number of operations done in a shorter amount of time. That's not necessarily true. It may be true in some cases, but it's not really the way you should approach the BulkMutateJobService. So some of the limitations, and I think we touched on some of these. There's one job queue per account with a 10 pending job limit, a 10 job limit, so kind of like your report service queue. And there are some kind of numerical limitations about how big a job can be. So a job can only have 500,000 operations and only so many parts, and currently only 10 scoped campaigns or one scoped account. So you currently can't create a job that affects a ton of campaigns at a time or multiple accounts at a time. So you're kind of limited to 10 campaigns and one account. I think the campaigns number is flexible. The account is obviously kind of more of a cross-client thing, and I think it takes some bigger changes, but these are the kind of the initial numbers that we can launch. And there are also limitations to how many streams you can have per part, how many operations per part, things like that. The other thing I touched on earlier is that there's currently no functionality to remove a pending job. So if you've somehow uploaded 2 parts and then you decide you want to stop for whatever reason, there's currently not the ability to kind of remove that job from your queue. And you can't cancel a job that's already run. I'll touch on that. And it's something that I think they understand people are interested in, and they're going to look into. And then the other one here is that you can't upload an entire campaign structure at once right now. And the reason is that you can't have one operation that adds a campaign, another that adds an ad group to that campaign, another that adds an ad to that ad group, because each of those sub-entities relies on the ID of the parent entity, right? You can't create an ad group until you know the campaign ID that you want to add it to. And you don't know that campaign ID until the campaign has been created. So it's kind of a chicken and egg situation right now where you can't, right at the moment, just create all of the objects for a whole new campaign and put them in one BulkMutate job. All right, well, I'll be around for the rest of the day. And if you have any other questions about the BulkMutateJobService or you want to start writing some code that uses it, I'm here to help.